Welcome to Church History Stories, where I explore fascinating and sometimes controversial topics from the history of the Church. Let's get to it. Today, we're diving into the story of Marcion, a figure so controversial that Polycarp, whom we discussed in our last video, called him the firstborn of Satan. But this wealthy shipbuilder would inadvertently help shape Christianity as we know it today. Imagine being so persuasive and influential that your ideas force the entire Christian church to deeply examine what it believes. That's exactly what Marcion did in the 2nd century. Born in Sinope, a bustling port city on the Black Sea, Marcion wasn't just any ordinary heretic. He was born into a Christian family. Tradition says his father was even a bishop, and grew up well-versed in Orthodox Christian teaching. But somewhere along the way, Marcion began to see things very differently, leading to one of the most significant theological controversies in Christian history. What's particularly fascinating is how thoroughly he developed his radical ideas. Unlike other heretical teachers who claimed secret knowledge passed down from the apostles, Marcion took a different approach. He presented himself as the one person who truly understood Paul's message about grace versus law. He argued that everyone else, including the other apostles, had corrupted Christianity by mixing it with Jewish ideas. This wasn't just a minor disagreement, it was a complete reinterpretation of Christianity's foundations. Marcion's historical context certainly shaped his ideas. He lived through one of the last major Jewish uprisings against Rome, witnessing the empire's brutal suppression of the revolt. Since many Romans still viewed Christianity as just another Jewish sect, Christians often suffered alongside Jews during these persecutions. Some historians suggest this might have influenced Marcion's desperate desire to separate Christianity completely from its Jewish roots. Perhaps he thought that if he could convince Rome that Christians had nothing to do with Judaism, the persecution would stop. Around 140 AD, Marcion arrived in Rome with significant wealth from his shipbuilding business and made a dramatic entrance into the Christian community there with a massive donation of 200,000 sesterces, well over 100 years of an average laborer's wages. But money couldn't buy acceptance for the radical theology he was about to propose. At the heart of his teaching was an idea that would shake the foundations of Christian thought. He effectively claimed there were two different gods. The God of the Old Testament, according to Marcion, was a harsh, judgmental deity focused on law and punishment. In contrast, he taught that Jesus revealed a completely different, superior God of love and mercy. This wasn't just a minor theological disagreement, it was a complete reimagining of Christianity that threatened to sever the religion from its Jewish roots. To support this radical view, Marcion wrote a book called The Antitheses, where he meticulously laid out what he saw as contradictions between the Old Testament God and the God revealed by Jesus. But Marcion didn't stop there. He did something unprecedented that would change Christianity forever. He created the first known Christian canon, a specifically chosen collection of religious texts. Rejecting the entire Old Testament, he accepted only Paul's letters, minus the pastoral epistles, and an edited version of Luke's Gospel, carefully removing anything he thought was too Jewish. His editing was meticulous and revealing. He removed the entire birth narrative from Luke's Gospel because it connected Jesus too strongly to Jewish prophecy. He cut out any references Jesus made to fulfilling Old Testament scripture. Even when Jesus spoke of Abraham, Moses, or David, Marcion carefully excised these passages. Looking at Romans 2:16, where Paul mentions my gospel in the singular, Marcion argued this proved there should only be one gospel, Luke's, stripped of its Jewish elements. He arranged Paul's letters with Galatians first, emphasizing what he saw as Paul's strongest statements against Jewish law. Even within Paul's letters, Marcion made careful edits, removing anything that painted the Creator God in a positive light or suggested continuity between the Old and New Testaments. The implications were enormous. By creating his own canon, Marcion forced the early church to confront a crucial question: which writings should Christians consider authoritative? His actions sparked a century-long process of the church, carefully considering and ultimately defining what we now know as the New Testament. It's one of history's great ironies that this heretic's actions helped accelerate the formation of the biblical canon we have today. Marcion's reach extended far beyond just theological debates. After his excommunication from the Roman Church in 144 AD, he established his own parallel church structure that rivaled the Orthodox Christian community. His churches had their own bishops, buildings, and distinct traditions. One church father complained that Marcionite churches multiplied faster than bees build beehives. The movement spread particularly strongly in the East, where Marcionite communities survived for centuries. In fact, as late as the 6th century, we have records of a bishop boasting about converting 8 Marcionite villages, thousands of people, to Orthodox Christianity. What made Marcion's version of Christianity so appealing to many? For one thing, it offered a seemingly simple solution to one of Christianity's most challenging questions. How can the same God be both strictly just and infinitely merciful? His followers practiced an austere form of Christianity that went beyond normal religious devotion. They rejected marriage entirely, believing that procreation only served to imprison more souls in physical bodies. They required strict fasting and abstinence from many pleasures of life. Marcion himself viewed the human body with such disdain that he reportedly called it a sack of excrement. But there was something even more radical about Marcion's Christology. He taught that Jesus possessed what he called uncreated flesh, a spiritual body that only appeared physical. This wasn't quite the same as other Gnostic teachings about Christ's nature. While Gnostics generally denied Christ had any body at all, Marcion insisted that Christ's death on the cross was real and essential. In his view, this death served as a payment to the Creator God, buying humanity's freedom from the harsh law-giving deity of the Old Testament. This complex view of Christ's nature and purpose shows us that Marcion wasn't simply anti-Jewish or anti-material. He was developing a completely new understanding of salvation history. The Church's response to Marcion helps us understand how early Christians thought about the relationship between love and justice. Irenaeus, one of the great early Christian theologians, argued that Marcion had fundamentally misunderstood God's nature. He used a powerful analogy that still resonates today. God is like a parent raising children to maturity. Just as good parents combine both love and discipline in raising their children, helping them learn to share, respect others, and live in community, God's justice and mercy work together for humanity's growth. A parent who only makes demands without showing understanding creates a damaged adult. Similarly, a parent who never sets boundaries or teaches right from wrong fails their child. The law wasn't opposed to love, it was an expression of it. What makes this theological debate so fascinating is how it forced the Church to articulate its understanding of salvation history. The early Church Fathers argued that throughout human history, God had been patiently working to develop humanity's moral and spiritual understanding. The calling of Abraham, the giving of the law to Moses, the messages of the prophets, and finally the coming of Jesus weren't contradictory events, but stages in a single divine plan. Like a master teacher, God was meeting humanity where they were, and gradually leading them to greater understanding. The lasting impact of the Marcion controversy extends far beyond his time. His questions about the relationship between the Old and New Testaments, between law and grace, between justice and mercy, continue to challenge Christians today. Even in modern times, some Christians unconsciously echo Marcion when they portray the Old Testament God as angry and vengeful while describing Jesus as only loving and forgiving, missing the complexity and continuity of God's character across both Testaments. What's particularly striking is how the Church's need to respond to Marcion helped shape its own development. When Marcion established his parallel church structure, complete with bishops and regular worship services, the Orthodox Church was forced to become more organized in response. His creation of a canon of Scripture pushed the Church to formally recognize which books belonged in the New Testament. Even his misunderstanding of Paul's teachings led to deeper study and appreciation of how Paul's message about law and grace was more nuanced than either Marcion or his opponents initially recognized. Perhaps the most important lesson from Marcion's story is how challenges to Orthodox Christianity often led to clearer articulation of what Christians believe. His heresy forced the Church to think more deeply about its relationship to Judaism, the unity of the Old and New Testaments, and which books should be considered Scripture. Sometimes the most significant contributions to religious thought come from unexpected and even unwelcome sources. If you want more videos exploring fascinating figures and controversies from church history, please like, share, and subscribe for more church history stories. Cheers.